The war in Ukraine has lasted longer than Russia expected, and now Moscow is on its knees begging some of the allies to return weapons it previously sold to them so it can keep itself stocked up for a war that so far seems to have no end in sight. At least that's the immediate message that many have pulled from a November report published in the Wall Street Journal. Apparently, secret talks have taken place, mostly focused on engines, with several countries meeting Moscow's demands. But is that report everything it's stacked up to be? That's the more interesting question. What may be seen as a sign of Russia's weakness in the face of a war that's gone on for too long may simply be an attempt by Russia to ensure it stays strong if support for Ukraine finally dwindles. Let's start by looking at what the report actually said. According to the WSJ, Moscow's entered secret talks with 4 countries in April 2022: Egypt, Belarus, Brazil, and Pakistan. The subjects of these talks appear to revolve around Moscow's desire to reclaim engines previously installed into Russian helicopters that Moscow needed to get back to strengthen its VKS, which is the country's air force. Immediately, the date should come to your attention: April 2022, just 2 months after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. That's interesting when you realize that according to a report by the Imperial War Museum, Putin initially believed that Russia would be able to take control of Ukraine in as little as 10 days. Obviously, that didn't happen. As of the making of this video, it's been over 20 months since the conflict started, and the war is raging as hard as ever. By April 2022, Moscow would have realized that Ukraine is clearly not the pushover it thought it would be, and that realization would have led to the Kremlin concluding that it needed more weaponry, especially enhanced air support, to continue its invasion. Hence the request to return the engines. The fact that these engines supposedly came from Russian helicopters rather than being made to order essentially grounded a crucial part of the VKS to the point where many of Moscow's helicopters were unusable until it got the engines back. Russia's arrogance came back to bite it. What's even more interesting is the responses varied when Russia returned with its tail between its legs and its cap in its hand to the countries that have received these engines. According to the WSJ, the first delegation Russia sent out landed in Cairo with a request that Egypt return at least 100 of the engines it had received from Russia. Egypt reportedly complied. The report states that the first delivery of engines from Cairo, likely to be 150 strong, probably began in December, though the WSJ sources couldn't confirm if more would be on their way. It's also telling that Egypt refused an American request to provide weapons and financial aid to Ukraine at around that same time. Perhaps Cairo saw the return of these engines as a chance to strengthen its relationship with Russia after what it likely saw as Moscow's inevitable victory in the war. A similar meeting in Belarus also bore fruit for Moscow, though that fruit was a lot lighter than that gained from Egypt. The report says Belarus agreed to send 6 Mi-26 helicopter engines back to Russia after its covert meeting. A small victory for Moscow, but a victory nonetheless. However, the country's meetings with Brazil and Pakistan appear to have been less successful. When approached for comment, Brazil claims it refused to comply with Russia's request. Russia wanted the return of 12 engines for Mi-35M military helicopters, with Brazil saying it abandoned the deal in face of disruption of other deals caused by the Ukraine conflict. Then there's Pakistan. Unlike the other 3 countries in which talks are all but confirmed to have taken place, Pakistan claims that it never received a request. This is contradicted by the WSJ's report, stating that Moscow asked to buy back 4 Mi-35M engines that it had earlier sold to Pakistan. Whether Pakistan actually did so is unknown, given the country is claiming those talks never took place. Pakistan may be acting like the talks didn't happen because it doesn't want to give the wrong impression to the US about its relationship with Russia. After all, the U.S. Embassy and Consulate in Pakistan claims that the states have provided about $32 billion in aid to Pakistan over the last 2 decades. That aid, both humanitarian and militaristic, has been drying up in recent years, with Pakistan likely not wanting a request from Russia to be the reason the U.S. pulls out even more of its money. Still, it's clear that Russia was desperate to get these helicopter engines back, even offering to buy them in the process. The question now is simple: why? We've already covered the most obvious answer, which is that these engines weren't manufactured specifically for sale. They were pulled out of Russia's existing helicopter fleet, which proved to be a problem once it was quickly revealed just how disastrous the tactics of Russia's Air Force were in Ukraine. In a November 2022 report published in Forbes, it was revealed that Valery Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian military commander-in-chief, estimated that Ukraine had shot down 278 Russian aircraft. That article goes on to claim that this is likely an exaggeration, but it does say that between February and November of 2022, Ukraine had brought down 54 helicopters along with 55 Russian fighter jets. Those are big numbers, far bigger than Putin was expecting. And with so many of his helicopters destroyed, it is no surprise that he needed to replenish his stock. But many of the helicopters he had left didn't have any engines, forcing him to go back to the very countries in which he'd sold those engines in the first place. In short, Putin needed the engines so he could get more helicopters off the ground. However, there are other potential reasons. In March 2023, Ukraine's Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexei Danilov, wrote on X, formerly Twitter, about how he believed that Russia was starting to run low on its weapon stockpile. He said Russia is running out of prepared stockpiles of weapons. Missiles and military equipment have been accumulating for decades. The calculations called for blitzkrieg, not blitz utilization. In other words, though the Russians might have had a ton of weapons stockpiled, many of them simply weren't ready to deploy in Ukraine. Danilov claims that most still aren't, again pointing out that Russia expected Ukraine to fold almost instantly to a blitzkrieg. When that didn't happen, Putin had to recalculate and prepare for an extended war, hence his need to go begging the other countries that Moscow had sold weapons to in order to get them back. Danilov goes on to claim that Russia's corrupt economy is to blame for its supposed inability to produce new weapons. He then calls foreign aid a matter of primary importance for Moscow, again implying that Russia has had to seek help from outside its borders just to maintain the war effort in Ukraine. How much of these claims are simply Ukrainian propaganda rather than reality is unclear. We know that Russia asked for helicopter engines back. According to Newsweek, Russia had also received large quantities of Shahed 136 drones from Iran, with rumors still flying around that China is also supplying weapons to the Russian war effort. So that gives us two potential reasons why Russia is begging for its weapons back. There's the obvious one. It needs helicopter engines to get its choppers into the air. But if Danilov is to be believed, the issue extends beyond Russia simply selling off what it likely considered unnecessary stock in the past. Instead, Russia might have a production crisis hampered by corruption that's preventing it from manufacturing the weapons it needs to subdue Ukraine. And subjugation is going to be high on the Russian agenda, as it knows that Ukraine is receiving weapons from foreign allies, meaning that it has to bolster its own stockpiles just to keep pace. At the beginning of November 2023, reports confirmed that a Ukrainian missile strike had killed 3 Russian colonels in the headquarters of Russia's Dnipro military group. That's a small victory for Ukraine, but it's not the important part of the story. According to a Telegram channel that supposedly has inside information about Russia's security forces, the missiles that landed weren't made in Ukraine, they were made in the United States. Specifically, they were Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS. The missiles, which have a range of about 100 miles, hit their target and took out 3 leaders of the force that Russia had created specifically to hold the Dnipro region. This has to be worrying news for Putin. Not only has he lost 3 high-ranking military officers to a missile strike, but he knows that those missiles came from the US. Of course, it's no secret that Ukraine is relying on foreign aid, financially and militarily speaking, but the fact that Ukraine is receiving this aid likely hints at why Russia is asking for its own weapons back. It's not fighting the Ukraine it thought it would be fighting. Ukraine is better armed than Russia expected thanks to foreign intervention, meaning the stockpile Russia had gathered for the war simply isn't enough. It needs more. That's why its arms trade is in such dire straits right now. According to Foreign Policy, exports of weapons out of Russia have fallen to levels not seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not because Russia doesn't have the weapons, rather it doesn't have weapons it can sell because it's having to dedicate more of them than it expected to the war due to Ukraine having support from so many Western allies. So not only is Putin trying to claw back weapons that he previously sold, but he's having to curtail one of Russia's most lucrative boom industries in the process. Russia can't sell weapons. All it can do is buy them back and manufacture more to support its war effort. That need for weapons is thrown into a stark light thanks to another November Newsweek report that discusses how Ukraine's armored vehicle fleet has reached the Dnieper River's east bank. Located in southern Ukraine, the river is currently controlled by Russia, though that control doesn't seem likely to last. Kyiv reported that it reached the river's occupied side back in October 2023, with the armored vehicle fleet serving as reinforcement for the troops that were already there. That occupation came 10 months after Ukraine managed to liberate the city of Kherson, located on the river's west bank, at the end of 2022. According to the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank in the United States, Ukraine's ambitions don't end with that river's west bank. It says that reports from Russian military bloggers suggest that Ukraine already has 300 people operating on the east side, with its goal now being to establish a base there so it can launch an offensive on the village of Krynki. Should Ukraine manage to take that village, it'll establish itself in a region that would allow it to launch further attacks on Russian supply lines, damaging Moscow's ability to take territory back. Again, we start seeing reasons why Russia is increasingly turning toward foreign aid. Not only is it depleting its existing resources in a war that's become far more drawn out than it thought it would be, but it's not actively winning that war. Ukraine is retaking territory from Russia, and from a Russian perspective, that territory needs to be reclaimed, which would mean more troops, more weapons, and more equipment at a time when Russia is supposedly running low on 2 of the 3. The ground situation is looking increasingly desperate for Russia, but it's not doing much better at sea either. Another November Newsweek report focused on Ukraine's clever asymmetrical tactics on the Black Sea Fleet, the naval vessels that Russia's relying on to give it a route into southern Ukraine. Those attacks, which combine assaults by Western-supplied missiles and drones, hit their high point in November when a cruise missile strike landed on the Oskol, a once powerful Russian cruiser. The ship is believed by many to be beyond repair, based on what satellite imagery shows of it now that it's docked in Crimea's Zaliv shipyard. Ukraine currently believes it's been taken out of the game, with its Office of Strategic Communications stating that the cruiser suffered significant damage and may not be repaired. While that strike is important, we see the true extent of why it worries Moscow when we look at the Black Sea Fleet as a whole. Since the Russian invasion, Ukraine has managed to hit 17 of Russia's seaborne vessels. Not all are part of the Black Sea Fleet. However, according to Newsweek, even those that aren't in the fleet were still operating in that area and likely cooperating with it. Worse yet for Putin, Ukraine hasn't focused all of its missile and drone attacks on ships. It's also targeting infrastructure. Defensive positions, command posts, and even the Sevastopol port that serves as the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters have all been targeted. Ukraine's attacks have a clear purpose: remove Russia from the Black Sea so that it can open up supply lines and navigational options that the Russians are trying to cut off. By taking out the Oskol, Ukraine has removed one more ship, one capable of firing cruise missiles ahead of the winter months. What's more shocking about Ukraine's success against the Black Sea Fleet is that the country barely has a naval force of its own, but it hasn't needed a navy. Once again, it's been able to rely on missiles and drones supplied by Western allies to take the fight to Russia's ships. The attacks on the Black Sea Fleet are so severe that Russia's been forced to flee from their main base in Sevastopol. On October 7, 2023, Al Jazeera published a report that pointed out how satellite imagery showed that at least 12 Russian vessels, including submarines, missile frigates, and landing ships, had moved from Sevastopol to other Russian-controlled ports. Some of those vessels ended up in smaller bases in Crimea, though the bulk ended up in Novorossiysk, a Russian port that's 186 miles away from Sevastopol. James Heapy, the British Defense Minister, called this the functional defeat of the Black Sea Fleet. Forced to abandon its main headquarters, the fleet is now dispersed to the point where it's no longer able to launch coordinated attacks against Ukraine. Beyond damaging ships, Ukraine also managed to destroy a shipyard with a dry dock that was crucial for Russian repairs. The Black Sea isn't free of Russian ships by any means, but it's far less dangerous to Ukraine than it used to be. These are losses that Russia did not expect to suffer. And again, they're losses that are only made possible because Ukraine has managed to secure missiles and drones from other countries. Even more reason for Russia to claw back some of its own weapons. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, with Russia's weapons and equipment buybacks ensuring its stockpiles keep pace with Ukraine's. But perhaps it's not really Ukraine that Russia's trying to match. It's the country's age-old enemy, the United States. The war in Ukraine hasn't been a conflict between two countries. The West has gotten heavily involved, albeit with funding and equipment rather than troops, and Putin finds himself fighting a battle against the US just as much as he's fighting with Ukraine. Global tensions have risen, and with Putin's repeated threats of the possibility of using nuclear warheads in Ukraine, a renewed focus has been placed on the nuclear stockpiles of both Russia and the US, and both are extensive. According to Newsweek, the two world powers account for 89% of the entire world's inventory of nuclear warheads. The countries are close to neck and neck in terms of their stockpiles, with Russia coming out slightly on top. The situation is worrying enough for the US that its House of Representatives passed a resolution in October that would provide an extra $19.114 billion for the continued modernization of the country's nuclear arms. That action alone is a swift reminder that for all of Russia's begging to get equipment back from other countries, it still presents a very clear danger to Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has managed to last far longer in the war than anybody, Russia especially, predicted. And with the backing of Western equipment, it's been able to engage in a war of attrition that has left Moscow scrambling to reclaim previously sold equipment. But Russia still has 5,889 stockpiled or retired nuclear warheads. The US isn't far behind, maintaining a stock of 5,244 warheads, but the Federation of American Scientists said that Russia is believed to be increasing its stockpiles. Perhaps asking for its old equipment and weaponry back is less a sign of stockpile shortages on Russia's end. It may just be that the country is trying to strengthen itself in every way possible, not only to beat back Ukrainian advantages in the war, but to ensure it's ready to fight other battles if Putin does push the nuclear button. However, Russia may not need to go that far. For all the support that Ukraine has received from its Western allies, Moscow may still feel that it has enough equipment and arms stockpiled that it'll outlast its enemy. And that feeling could be buoyed by recent reports that suggest bad news for Ukraine's future. Support from other countries is drying up. According to a November report in The Guardian, the special fund that the US allocated for Ukraine is 96% depleted. In other words, it's almost all gone, and there's no guarantee that more money is coming. Though President Joe Biden has asked Congress to pass a bill that would secure an additional $106 billion for its overseas military fund, which would also benefit Israel, he doesn't have complete support for the motion. That's highlighted in an August survey conducted by CNN, which shows that a very slim majority of Americans, 51%, believe that the country has already done enough to help Ukraine. There's also an increasing divide between Democrats and Republicans on the Ukraine issue. Though 62% of Democrats say that additional funding is needed, just 28% of Republicans agree. Combine that faltering popular support with a speaker issue in the House of Representatives, which have at times rendered the House useless, and Biden's bill may have a hard time passing anytime soon. That is terrible news for Ukraine, which has become increasingly reliant on US aid. And the situation goes from bad to worse when you expand the scope of the other countries providing aid to Ukraine. For example, Slovakia's new government has rejected a previously agreed-upon military aid package, following through on its promise to end aid to Kyiv if it were to be elected. That amounts to the loss of 140 air defense rockets, along with about 4 million rounds of ammunition for small arms lost in the blink of an eye. The UK may also be struggling to back up its desired support for Ukraine in its war effort. Though support for Ukraine remains fairly high in the country, there are rumors that the UK is simply running out of arms to send over. That's according to The Telegraph, which reported on a senior military official in Britain saying that the UK has run out of defense equipment and that other countries should start shouldering more of the burden. Poland, which has long been one of Ukraine's biggest allies, has also cut Kyiv off. A report in The Guardian points out that a dispute between Poland and Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, over Poland banning Ukrainian grain imports has escalated to the point where Poland has said enough. Poland's President Andrzej Duda fired back, claiming that Ukraine is like a drowning person clinging to anything available. And on September 20th, Poland struck a huge blow when its Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, said that it was no longer sending arms to Ukraine because it was focusing on modernizing its own military. None of this will have escaped Russia's notice. As it looks at the situation in Ukraine, it may think it's seeing rats fleeing from a sinking ship. Yes, Ukraine enjoyed overwhelming support when the war started near the beginning of 2022, but it's nearly the end of 2023, and the war isn't over yet. Support for Ukraine is drying up as the world becomes increasingly war-weary, and various countries find themselves as concerned about their own futures as they are about Ukraine's. Perhaps this all casts a different light on Russia begging other countries for the return of equipment. Maybe the Kremlin saw this coming after its blitzkrieg failed, with its attempts to get arms back simply being a way to reinforce itself so it could stay in the war for the long haul. After all, aid to Ukraine can't last forever. We're seeing that now as several countries have already withdrawn their support, while some of Ukraine's richest allies, especially the UK and the US, may field budgetary concerns in the near future. Even Poland, which has developed one of continental Europe's best militaries, is out of the picture, at least for now, which is only good news for the Russians. Was Russia's reclamation of previously sold arms really an act of desperation once it realized that Ukraine wouldn't go down so easily? Or was it a tactical move to reinforce its stockpiles, maximizing its military's future potential in the process? Because Russia knew that support for Ukraine couldn't last forever. The smart money seems to fall on the latter, especially amidst reports that Russia is supposedly cooperating with China and building its already impressive nuclear reserves. But what do you think? Did Russia beg for its old weapons back, or did it adapt well to a war of attrition that seems to be inching closer to winning as support for Ukraine wavers? Tell us what you think below. Now watch Could Alliance of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran destroy NATO? Or check out this video instead.